Not everyone who wants to sit at your table should be allowed to. That statement might sound harsh at first, but it's one of the most necessary truths for anyone serious about growth. We live in a culture that confuses openness with wisdom, inclusion with integrity, and tolerance with strength. But real strength, mature, grounded, self-respecting strength knows when to say no. And one of the most important places to say no is in who you allow access to your inner world. There's a fundamental distinction we have to make, and it starts here. Asterisk access is not love. Giving someone a place in your life, whether that's your time, your trust, or your energy, is not proof of your compassion. It's a measure of your responsibility. You don't owe everyone your availability. That includes old friends, family, co-workers, even people you once loved. The simple fact that someone wants a seat at your table doesn't mean they've earned it. In fact, many people show up to your life not to add value, but to take it. Not because they're evil, but because they are unconscious, chaotic, or self-serving. And if you're not aware of this, you'll mistake proximity for purpose and find yourself surrounded by people who drain you while praising you. This is where it gets psychological. A lot of us were trained, often by subtle emotional patterns, to equate being kind with being available. You grow up thinking, if I say no, I'm selfish. If I set boundaries, I'm cold. If I walk away, I'm disloyal. But those messages aren't moral, they're manipulative. They keep you entangled in dynamics where you're constantly proving your goodness through your exhaustion. And the more exhausted you are, the easier it is for others to guilt you into staying that way. But here's the truth. Asterisk boundaries aren't barriers to love. They're the structure that protects it. When you allow anyone to sit at your table, regardless of their behavior, their mindset, their energy, you're not being generous. You're being careless with yourself, with your purpose, with the sacred work of becoming who you're meant to be. Because make no mistake, as your future is being shaped by your associations, the laughed, the voices you let close, behaviors you tolerate, the energy you absorb, all of it is shaping your identity whether you realize it or not. And there's a concept in cognitive psychology known as emotional contagion. Cited. The idea that emotions are not isolated, they're infectious. When you consistently surround yourself with people who are bitter, defensive, cynical, or chaotic, those emotional patterns start to creep into you. You start speaking like them, thinking like them, seeing life through their filter, not because you've consciously chosen it, but because the mind adapts to its environment. And if your environment is loud, unprincipled, or desperate for attention, you will slowly start to forget your values just to keep up. This is why access must be earned, not freely given. The table is a metaphor for intimacy, for influence, for proximity to your heart and mind. And that space, that closeness, should never be occupied by someone who doesn't treat it with care. That's not arrogance, that's stewardship, that's self-respect in motion. You see, part of maturing, part of really changing, is realizing that your energy is not infinite. Your time is not renewable, your attention is not disposable. Every time you give it to someone who doesn't honor it, you're stealing it from someone or something that does. And sometimes that someone is your own future self, the one you're supposed to be building, the one that's waiting for you on the other side of difficult decisions. This is where discernment comes in. Discernment says, I can love you and still walk away. I can forgive you and still not invite you back. I can care about your story and still decide it's not part of mine anymore. That's not cruelty, it's clarity. And clarity is a gift you give to both yourself and to others. Because when you keep someone at your table who doesn't belong, you're not helping them grow. You're enabling their stagnation. You're affirming a version of them that should have been challenged, not rewarded. And one final thing, asterisk, you teach people how to treat you by what you allow. If you allow disrespect, inconsistency, dishonesty, or manipulation, you're sending a message, not just to them, but to yourself. You're reinforcing the lie that your space, your peace, your life is a public playground, and it's not. You don't have to build walls, but you have to build doors, and those doors need locks, because not every soul that knocks should be let in. Some people are better appreciated from a distance, others not at all. And that decision, while difficult, is necessary if you want to protect the kind of life worth living. So stop apologizing for curating your space. Your table is sacred, and sacred things are not handed out, they're honored. Let your standards reflect your value, and never forget your peace is your responsibility, not their privilege. Loyalty is a virtue, but like all virtues, when taken too far or applied blindly, it becomes a vice. There's a subtle but critical distinction between loyalty and self-betrayal, and most people don't see it until it's too late. You're taught early on to be loyal to your friends, to your family, to the people who were there when you were struggling. That's admirable. But what happens when those same people are the ones holding you back? What happens when the people at your table, out of fear, insecurity, or emotional chaos, begin to sabotage your peace? At that point, loyalty stops being a virtue. It becomes a chain. And the tragic truth is that many people would rather stay chained than face the discomfort of detaching. They keep toxic connections alive, not because those connections serve them, but because those connections are familiar schlestum and familiarity. Psychologically speaking, the human mind is wired to seek patterns, and the emotional brain often equates familiar with safe, even when it's not. That's how dysfunction becomes home. That's how chaos earns our allegiance. You tell yourself, but they've been in my life for years, as if time spent is a justification for energy wasted. You say, but they're family, as if blood is an excuse for emotional violence. You say, they helped me once, as if one good act gives them a lifelong pass to disrespect your boundaries. That's not loyalty, that's fear wrapped in a virtue. Look deeper and you'll often find that what keeps people tethered to toxic relationships isn't integrity, it's guilt. It's the quiet, unspoken belief that leaving people behind makes you the villain to slaughter. And that belief is incredibly hard to shake, especially if you grew up in an environment where your role was to keep the peace, to absorb tension, to be the emotional anchor for people who never learned how to carry their own weight. When you internalize that role, you start to confuse your identity with your usefulness. And once that happens, you don't just tolerate dysfunction, you protect it. You start managing other people's chaos like it's your full-time job. You feel responsible for their moods, their reactions, even their poor decisions. But here's the painful truth, asterisk, you cannot heal in the same environment that made you sick. And sometimes the very people you feel most loyal to are the ones who taught you to abandon yourself in the first place. They trained you to lower your standards, to normalize dysfunction, to make peace with disrespect. And when you finally start to wake up, when you begin growing beyond that version of yourself, they'll try to pull you back. Not necessarily out of malice, but out of fear. Your growth exposes their stagnation. Your clarity disrupts the equilibrium of the relationship, and they'll frame your evolution as betrayal when really it's self-respect. This is why unlearning blind loyalty is one of the most psychologically demanding tasks you'll ever face. It requires deep introspection. It requires the courage to say, just because I've known you forever doesn't mean you deserve a seat in my future. And saying, that doesn't make you cold, it makes you clear, because peace is not something you stumble into, it's something you protect. And the more you grow, the more you'll realize how few people are actually capable of walking with you without bringing their noise into your silence. It's a tough pill to swallow, but necessary. Asterisk, not everyone grows just because you do. Some people are committed to their chaos. Some people don't want solutions. They want sympathy. They don't want to evolve. They want want a comfortable place to stay the same. And the moment you start challenging that by becoming more disciplined, more self-aware, more focused, they'll start calling you distant, arrogant, or selfish. Not because you've changed in a negative way, but because your change is a threat to their excuses. This is where emotional clarity becomes essential. You have to be willing to ask, Queet, is this relationship aligned with where I'm going, or is it dragging me back to who I used to be? And if the answer is the latter, then the most loving thing you can do for yourself and for them is walk away. Not with bitterness, not with hate, but with the quiet conviction that your loyalty must first belong to your own becoming. If you don't do this, you'll end up trapped, and what's worse, you'll become resentful. You'll resent the people you kept in your life out of guilt. You'll resent yourself for shrinking to keep them comfortable, and that resentment will bleed into everything, your creativity, your confidence, your peace, until you wake up one day realizing that your life has become a reflection of someone else's comfort zone. So here's the standard asterisk: if someone cannot respect your peace, they don't deserve access to your presence. Let go of the guilt, let go of the stories, let go of the need to be understood by people committed to misunderstanding you. That's not cruelty, it's clarity. And clarity is the beginning of freedom. The truth is simple. Protecting your peace is not betrayal. It's the highest form of loyalty to your future self. Don't confuse your silence for weakness. It's your boundary speaking on your behalf. If you really want to understand where someone is going, look at who they sit with. Look at who they allow into their emotional space, their table, so to speak. Because your table isn't just a metaphor for social interaction, it's a mirror of your identity. The people you consistently allow around you are reflections of the standards you've either consciously upheld or unconsciously compromised. And in a culture that glorifies inclusion for the sake of appearing open-minded, few people have the courage to admit that not everyone should be close to you, Lasu. Not because they're bad, but because they're misaligned. Who you choose to give your attention to matters, and not just in practical terms of time management or energy, though that matters too, but at a much deeper level. It speaks volumes about how you see yourself. The invitations you extend, explicit or implicit, signal to the world what kind of treatment you're willing to tolerate. And even more than that, they silently reveal the internal story you're telling yourself about what you're worth. If you let chaos sit at your table long enough, you start to call it normal. If you surround yourself with people who constantly complain, diminish, or distract, you'll begin adjusting your emotional state to match theirs. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually, like a rope fraying under tension. One comment here, one compromise there. Over time, you start making room for things you once swore you'd never tolerate. Not because you're weak, but because you haven't updated your environment to reflect your growth. And here's the reality: your environment is always shaping you live psychologically. We know that humans are deeply social creatures. Your thoughts, values, and self-concept are constantly influenced by the people closest to you. And the frightening part, this influence is mostly unconscious. You don't notice how your standards lower until you're already justifying them. You don't realize how your goals shrink until you're surrounded by people who treat ambition like arrogance. You don't catch how your speech changes, how your values erode, how your energy dims, until you look around one day and wonder why you feel disconnected from yourself. So the question becomes, who is at your table and what are they doing to your identity? Some people are mirrors of your past. They reflect back to you who you used to be, your insecurities, your old patterns, your former limitations. And keeping them close is comforting because they don't require you to grow. They affirm the old script. But if you're serious about change, you can't keep having dinner with your old self. And that includes the people who still talk to you like you haven't evolved, like you're still playing small, like you're still desperate for validation or unable to stand alone. They may not mean harm, but their presence reinforces a story you've already outgrown. Then there are those who aren't necessarily toxic, but they're noisy, distracted, unfocused, emotionally reactive. They live in a state of constant externalization, never taking ownership, always pointing fingers. These people will clutter your inner space with their unprocessed energy. And again, it's not always obvious, but over time you'll notice that being around them leaves you feeling anxious, depleted, disoriented. That's not a coincidence. That's your nervous system reacting to an unclean psychological environment. And finally, there are people who quite simply don't want you to grow. They may smile when you win, but there's tension beneath it. They may offer support, but there's always a subtle undercurrent of control or guilt. These individuals thrive when you stay predictable, when you stay stuck, and they may not say it directly, but your success makes them uncomfortable because it reminds them of everything they've refused to confront in themselves. Now, I'm not saying your table should be reserved only for perfect people. No one is, we're all flawed, growing, messy, but there's a difference between people who are massed committed to growth and people who are committed to staying stuck. And if your table is filled with a ladder, your life will reflect it. Your standards will shrink to fit the room. Your vision will become cloudy. Your progress will stall, not because you're not capable, but because the people around you are dragging your identity back to a version that no longer fits. It takes discipline to protect your space, and it takes deep self-awareness to admit when your relationships don't match the life you say you want. But if you don't do that work, you'll spend your life wondering why nothing feels aligned, why your confidence is inconsistent, why your peace is fragile. It's not because you're broken, it's because you've let the wrong people speak into your mind for too long. So if you want to change your life, change your table, curate it like your future depends on it, because it does. Sit with people who challenge your thinking, not your self-worth, who stretch your vision, not shrink your dreams, who make you feel more like yourself, not less.